Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cognitive Development in Early Childhood. Like your other chapters, this one's pretty dense, so I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think are really important to know, especially as we forge ahead with development in young children. And if you are somebody who is going to teach very young children, this is going to be especially applicable to you. So what's really great about early childhood development, and keep in mind that this is ages 2 through 6, roughly the kindergarten, preschool years, that the brain development and the cognition, kids are doing pretty interesting things. When children integrate past and present experiences, for example, that means that they can anticipate things. They can know that, oh yeah, mom said she's going to the store. I'm going to ask her what she bought when she got home. Now that seems pretty simple, but in order to do that, a child has to actually make a connection between the past and the present. Young children can also anticipate the future. At the younger end of the spectrum, they have trouble with like the near future and the far future, but they're able to see that time is different, that yesterday isn't today, that they can anticipate something else happening tomorrow. They can appreciate causality. I took the medicine and I feel better. They also start relying on language differently. Instead of just making like barking noises when you bring up a dog, what does a dog do? What is a dog? They're more likely to start categorizing things. Well, a dog is an animal. A pan is a dish. These are things we put in cupboards. And they're more able to recognize relationships between things, like I'm taller than Bobby but shorter than John. And so while all this seems pretty simple because we've all been there, it's actually pretty exciting. Now there's limitations too, and we're going to talk about that. But what I think would be a good exercise for you to do is take a look at the video that I will embed in this week's module, and take a look at these small children explaining the plot of Star Wars. And what you're going to see is this stuff in action. Relationships between characters, what happens next. It's actually pretty fun to watch. So, little children doing pretty interesting cognitive moves. I want to talk especially about language development because so much of cognition and language are tied up in each other, and I'm going to explain how that works in a minute. But there's different explanations for how language development develops. Again, the behaviorists are going to say, well, we get reinforcement for language, so that's why we talk. And the nativists are going to say, no, we have built-in apparatuses for language. And the social cognitive folks are going to say, no, we learn language from interactions with other people, with caregivers. And the information processing folks are going to say, well, language develops more quickly because our working memory gets bigger, because some things become automatic and it frees up more time and attention for the brain to think linguistically. But what's really amazing is these linguistic milestones, and these are pretty conservative, but basically if you're a kindergarten teacher, those 5-year-olds should come to you with thousands of words under their belt, and with the basic grammar structures, a basic knowledge about how language operates. They're going to have more receptive vocabulary than expressive vocabulary. That means that they understand more words than they actually use. And they're going to over-regularize things because they're internalizing the structures of language, and so they know patterns, and so they don't recognize irregular patterns yet. And so what you do is you get little kids who are like, I brushed my tooths, because if you have one tooth, you should add an S to that and have tooths. You'll hear little kids say, I go to McDonald's. And while that sounds unsophisticated, it's actually quite sophisticated, because those little children are actually using grammatical structures to make the best possible guess about how language should actually work. So I think it's worth mentioning bilingualism because you will have bilingual students in your classes. And the upside is that children who have different languages spoken at home, especially if there's more than one language spoken at home, the benefits are that they have an increased awareness of grammar and language, and they are actually learning language at this very sensitive time period when it's possible for them to learn language quicker and not have a dialect. The downside is that if those children don't hear the second language, say that second language is English, at least 25% of the time at home, they're not going to learn it well. They're not going to be as masterful as a primary language learner. So English language learners, if there's no English spoken at home, need explicit instruction so that they don't start falling behind. Now, Vygotsky and Piaget, we've mentioned them before, they had really different ideas about how language worked, how we learned it. And so Piaget, his feeling was you had to understand language to use it. So that's the premise that's behind, say, giving kids lists of vocabulary words and teaching meanings and then reading the story, right? Vygotsky flipped that. He's like, no, you have to use language to understand it. And so when you get my assignments in this class and you're like, wow, what's the deal with having to use all of these terms in context? That's because my assumptions are more in line with Vygotsky and due to my own experiences. The more I use language, the more those concepts become clearer to me. And so how you teach language often depends on your assumptions. So Vygotsky not only believed that we internalize concepts by using the language and not the other way around. He believed that we learn through the culture that we grow up in. He was very much a context guy, and that the way we learned was through someone who's more advanced helping us along. And so the teacher's role is something like a ladder, helping you get to that apple. Piaget, on the other hand, felt like learning was more about learning happened when you faced something you couldn't explain. And so you had to enlarge your current understanding or schema for a thing, like this little girl who's holding an insect that also looks like a plant. How do you revise your categories and revise your thinking to accommodate new information? And Piaget believed that you developed first in order to learn, unlike Vygotsky, who felt like you learned first and as a result, you developed. So those two theorists really thought about this differently, and I think in interesting ways. So if we're thinking Piaget, these early childhood kids would be in what he called the preoperational period. And remember that operations, according to Piaget, are actions that are carried out and rehearsed and reversed mentally in your mind. Now, these little people aren't really doing that. They're bad at that right now. So he's calling this the preoperational period because little children are they have trouble with reversible thinking. They have trouble with conservation tasks. His classic one, and I'm sure you've seen this, if you haven't, I'll embed a video, where if you give a child the same amount of liquid and put one in a taller container and one in a shorter container, children at this stage invariably think that the taller one has more liquid in it, whether or not they watch the adult pour the same amount of liquid in there. The same goes with the girl and the top picture with the coins. She can count them. She can see that there is the same amount of coins at the top line as the second line. But as soon as that researcher spreads the top line out so it looks longer, that child will think that that's a lot, that there's more money in that line, because she has trouble with what's called reversible thinking, that in her mind, she doesn't just bring those coins back together. So while amazing things are happening, there's still some interesting limitations that little children have before they start school. Now, one of the interesting things that Piaget noticed that was happening with small children was this increased sophistication in what he called the semiotic function. That is the ability to work with signs and symbols, using one thing to represent another. So it's one thing to be outside and see an actual tree, look at it and say, hey, that is a tree. And it's another thing to look at a book and say, that thing, that blob of green on top of the brown, that also is a tree. And notice that we even move to a higher level of abstraction when we use the word tree, which doesn't even look like a tree at all anymore. And so these are really, really big mental moves, especially as we start teaching children to read, that objects turn into symbols of objects that turn into signs for objects. And so it takes a little while to do this. While some children are reading by kindergarten, many are not yet. So the developmental order of this semiotic function, according to Piaget, was that the first thing that you would do is that you need a deferred imagination first. And that means that children would imitate the sounds and actions of people or objects who were not in the room. So they could, if they were a fan of, say Snoopy, they could, imitate Snoopy or pretend to be the dog. That the next part of this developmental order would be that children would use symbolic play, meaning that they're using one thing to represent another. So everybody's got the blocks, but one kid is making a castle and another kid is making a school. The third stage in that, he thought, was that you'd actually start scribbling, you'd actually start writing, and that scribbles would actually turn into representations of things. And you'll watch this with young children, and it's fun because the first stuff they draw makes no sense at all. And then little by little, it starts to turn into symbols and eventually signs. And finally, the last step in this is mental images, that they can conjure what something looks like based on language. So one of the things that is interesting about young children is that they're still developing what's called a theory of mind, meaning that they don't really understand that what's in my head is not in their head. And in that way, Piaget thought they were egocentric. So if this child, for instance, is given a box that says crayons on it, and he finds that there's actually candles inside, he will think that everybody else knows that too, because he knows that. And so this theory of mind, this understanding that what's in somebody else's mind who was maybe not in the room when, say, Dad hid the keys, wouldn't understand that. So Piaget saw this underdeveloped theory of mind and this tendency for young children to engage in conversation that really lacks interaction. It's kind of funny to watch small children because they can be in the same room and have completely different monologues going on, completely different games. They are in their own heads. Piaget just felt like what that meant was children lacked the ability to step into somebody else's shoes, and that they were egotistical, little self-centered people. But what Vygotsky thought about that was that this private speech while children played, that it was actually serving a social function, so that children would pretend that their teddy bear was talking to them, or they were talking to their teddy bear to say, no, 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 we don't throw things, as a way to start regulating their own behavior, that they are actually internalizing the social mores and language in play, and that this stuff that looks egocentric is actually quite amazing and socially oriented. And so play, pretending, imaginary friends, the things that happen at this young age are always that children figure out how the world works. And one of my favorite studies is The Monster in a Box, in which Paul, that really illustrated how young children don't really differentiate as much as adults at all, the difference between imagination and reality. And so Paul Harris would invite small children in and say, well, there's a monster in that box over there, and then they'd talk about whether or not there really was a monster in the box. And then he'd admit, no, there probably isn't, right? And the child would be like, yep, there's not a monster in the box. And then he would step out of the room and he would watch. Nonetheless, even though they had established there was no monster in that box, the children would still move away from it. And so you have a fantastic area of development in which there's a very thin line between imagination and reality. A last thing I want to mention is how working memory theorists would talk about this developmental age, which is to say that the more things get automatic, the more information you can hold in working memory at a time. So you can not just jump the rope, but you can also talk to someone as you jump the rope and notice that your mom is driving up in the car and may have ice cream. So that because some things get automatic, because you know what to say in certain situations, you free up more working memory for learning. And so this working memory has a deep relationship with this executive functioning. And remember that executive functioning is really that set of mental skills that help you get things done. Remember this, the reptilian brain, the emotional brain, the neocortex, that, my friends, is where all of that executive functioning happens. So executive functioning is just developing during this time. And so you can see that little children are better able to regulate and control their cognitive processes. Like they can ask questions if they don't understand something. They can try to reason out things. They can try to plan things that they want to do. And problems with attention and behavior are usually, if you have a child that has trouble concentrating, that is acting out, that in a class or in a daycare, it's usually that one of the explanations, one of the most common explanations, is that their executive functioning just is still very much in development, that they have this reptilian brain, they have the emotional brain, but this planning center, it's still, this self-regulation just takes time. So when it comes to theories of mind, and with students, with children having trouble realizing that what's in somebody else's mind isn't in their mind, sometimes children who have trouble interacting have what's called an autism spectrum disorder. And it's characterized by an underdeveloped theory of mind. It's really hard for children with autism to use perspective taking. Like they're more inclined to like just barrel off and take a toy or something because they haven't stopped to think how that will make that other child feel. And they also have a lot of trouble with joint attention, like focusing on a task together, or a game together. So if this picture of these two girls looking at each other's work, that's probably not that's indicative of not a problem with autism, because they seem interested in what each other is doing. And so something that is worth looking for when you have problematic or odd interactions between children is it's worth looking at autism spectrum disorder, because autism is not just the debilitating condition it used to be defined as. So what I want you to do this week is take a look at the child that you built last week and describe its cognitive development, and at this wonderful age between 2 and 6. Make sure to give your child a precise age, because what you'll notice is that there's a pretty big change between 2 and 6. So give your child a precise age, and then use terms from the book to talk about what your child knows, what your child doesn't know, what they're good at so far, what they're not good at so far, when it comes to the sophistication of their thinking and language use. And I look forward to your thinking this week.